And so last week we kicked off this series called Overcome. And what we wanted to do over the next few weeks is just walk you through stories in the life of David. Whether you've grown up in church your entire life or maybe today's your first day in church, whatever that looks like for you, most of us are familiar or have heard of David, King David, and even today's story, which is David and Goliath. Like at some point you've heard that reference in your life. And so we're going to look at some stories over the next few weeks about David and his life and how he was able to overcome certain things in his life. And so last week we looked at the idea of David being chosen. We were in 1 Samuel chapter 16 last week, and we looked at the fact that David was kind of the underdog in the story. That as King Saul was made king and was seeking after God and was a godly man, but some things started to go wrong in his kingship and his authority, that he began to take his eyes off of God and put his eyes on himself. And when Saul became prideful, then God decided that Saul wasn't the man for the job anymore, that there needed to be a new king at some point. And so God sent Samuel out to Jesse, which is David's father, and said, one of his sons will be king. Will be the new king, and you are to anoint them and pour oil over their head. And Samuel set out to go see Jesse and his 8 sons, and one by one, all of Jesse's sons passed in front of Samuel. And Samuel's like, no, not you, not you, not you, not you. To the 7 older ones were done. And he's like, is there anyone else? Do you have another son? Is there anybody else that you have? And Jesse's like, well, I mean, there's David, my youngest. He's out in the field though, tending to the sheep, doing what he does. It can't be him. It's got to be one of these guys. Samuel says, send for him. And the moment that David walks into the room, or David walks into the presence of Samuel, God speaks to Samuel and says, this is my man. This is the one that you are to anoint. And last week I told you that God knows the plan for your life before you even realize your potential. That God knows the plan for your life before you even realize your potential was the point that we wanted to drive home last week. And so today we're going to be in 1 Samuel 17, and you can turn there if you want. We're going to get there in just a few minutes. You can follow along with me. And we're going to look at, like I said, what is a very familiar story to most of us in the room of David and Goliath. You've heard the story told many different ways, whether you've grown up in church from Sunday school to kids' church to adult church. You've heard the story. You've heard different ways that it's presented. I've always preached it the same way. Every single time I've ever told the story until today, I've got a different spin on it that I want to give you today. And so I'm going to ask for a little bit of lenience from you guys today, because there's not going to be a whole lot of scripture on the screen, but I just want to paint this story for you of David and Goliath. It's an extremely long chapter, but I just want to paint this story for you of David and Goliath and then apply it to our lives at the end of the message, and hopefully we'll be able to walk away with something. And so look with me in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And you can follow along. Most of this isn't going to be on the screen until we get to a certain point, but just follow along with me. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we see the story of David and Goliath, like I said, that most of us are familiar with. But in the story, the Israelites and Saul and his army are getting ready to face the Philistines, which is kind of their arch enemy, kind of their arch rival. They've had a couple battles already that we have read about. If you've read 1 Samuel, they've had a couple of other battles. And you got this picture and this. I want you to envision kind of where we are today. Like you need to imagine. If you don't have an imagination, get one, right? Because you need one for this morning. Because you need to figure out where we're at and what's happening. Because I want to paint this picture for you. That as this battle is about to take place and as this battle is about to happen, you've got this valley in the center between these two mountains. And on one mountaintop is the Israelites and Saul and his army. And they're up here. And on this other mountaintop is the Philistines and Goliath and his warriors. And they're standing on this mountaintop and they're getting ready to rush into this valley to battle one another. There's something about warfare and something about like old school battles to me that's pretty amazing. Like, right? There wasn't tanks and stealth fighters and fighter planes. Like you just lined up and they were there and you're like, we're coming for you. And they're like, we're coming for you. And then somebody said charge and boom, like you just went, right? And you just killed the guy in front of you. Like that's intense. And I can only imagine the Philistines on one mountaintop and the Israelites on the other, and they're getting ready to battle, and they're probably pumping each other up, and Saul's riding his horse. Like if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, which is my favorite movie of all time, right? Maximus is riding back and forth in front of his men, and he's pumping them up, and he's just like, we're going to battle, and we're going to go into this, and everybody's pumped up. Yeah! They're all ready to go, and they've got their hands on their swords, and they're just ready, right? I just imagine that being the scene. That the Philistines are pumped and the Israelites are pumped and everybody's just going to rush into the valley and they're going to battle one another. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the story, Goliath kind of takes charge. He is this mountain of a man, right? Last night I got the UFC pay-per-view last night, and I don't usually get them, and yes, I like UFC, and if you have a problem with that, I'm sorry, right? And so we get UFC. And I'm watching this, and Brock Lesnar, if you know anything about UFC or WWE wrestling, Brock Lesnar is this gigantic man, right? He's 6'3", 265 pounds. He's a freak in nature. And he's fighting this other dude that's 265 pounds, and he makes him look small. Like, it's just crazy. And he's 6'3", 265, but when we see the story of Goliath, it tells us in here, like, by measurements of cubits and stuff, but to put it in terms that we can understand, he's 9 feet tall. He's over 9 feet tall. He's got 120 pounds of armor on him. Like, he is a giant of a man. Like, literally. I mean, I've met somebody the other day who was 7 foot tall, and I'm 6 foot, and I was just like, wow, you're really big, right? And 2 feet taller than him. And just imagine how big Goliath is. And Goliath walks down into the valley and just kind of changes the battle scene. Changes what's happening. And says, hey guys, here's what's up. And he walks in and says, here's how things are going to go down. You're going to send your best man, and I'm going to fight them, and we're going to be here. And you send your man, and I'll be here. And if he kills me, then we'll be your slaves. But if I kill him, then you'll be our slaves. And this is how this thing's going to go down. And he's talking trash, and he's talking down to them, and he's calling them out, and he's calling out their manhood, basically, and he's challenging them in every way. He's taunting them. And it's like, this is how this is going to go down. And day after day and night after day and night, he just continues to go out to the valley and call them out. And it says that the Israelites in that moment, right, that the Israelites were strucken with fear the second that Goliath walked onto the scene. Right, so we're talking a few minutes ago about the Philistines are up here and the Israelites are up on their mountaintop and they're pumped and they're ready. Yeah, I'm going to battle. Whoa! Right, they're all pumped and excited and ready to go. And all of a sudden Goliath walks out and the whole thing changes. Like, whoa, wait a minute. Right? Like, you ever been in high school or middle school and you're going to get in a fight with somebody and then his friend walked up and his friend's big and you're like, oh, never mind, bro, I'm good. Right? I'm not that mad at you. Right? And so Goliath walks onto the scene. Right? And everything changes. It says that they were struck with fear, that they were dismayed. They didn't know what to do with themselves. They're scared to death all of a sudden because this 9-foot giant has walked into the valley. And they don't know what to do. And as you read through the beginning portion of chapter 17, it says that he just continued to taunt them, continued to control them. Continue to walk out day after day after day after day, calling them out, challenging them. And the Israelites are so afraid that they won't send anyone into the valley. They won't send anyone into the valley to fight Goliath because nobody wants a piece of him. Nobody wants to take on the 9-foot giant with 120 pounds of armor. It talks about his spear, that his spear, the head of his spear weighs 15 pounds, right? I mean, think about that. I mean, if that hits you, you're done for, right? He's a big man with all kinds of stuff, and nobody wants anything to do with him. And then all of a sudden, the story changes a little bit. And then Samuel takes us on a new journey, starting in verse 17. That's all in the first 16 verses of chapter 17 as this battle is raging and Goliath is calling them out. All of that's happening in only 16 verses. And in verse 17, the story takes a little bit of a turn. where Jesse tells David, hey, all of your brothers are in battle. All of your brothers are with Saul and with the army, and they're up on the mountaintop, and they're doing their thing, and they're in battle, but you're here tending the sheep, doing what a good young brother does, doing your job here at the house, but I need you to take some food to your brothers. They're probably hungry out on the battle lines. And so David delegates his responsibilities for the sheep that day, and he heads out the next morning and heads out to go meet his brothers. And remember, at this time, David's just a young teenage boy. Like, he's not King David. He's not this mighty warrior that we see later in the Scriptures. He's a young teenage boy, where it told us last week that he was ruddy, which means he's got a dark complexion from probably being out in the sun all the time. That he's ruddy and handsome and young. So he's probably 13, 14, 15 years old maybe. And David rolls up on the scene, and he sees Goliath out calling out his fellow soldiers and calling out his brothers and calling all these people out. And he sees how shaken with fear they are, right? That they're all just kind of curled up in the corner shaking like, I don't want to fight him, right? They're all scared to death of Goliath. And here this teenage boy rolls up on the scene, and everything changes. And as you look in the first, I guess I think it's around verse 18 or 19, maybe around 20 or so. It says that as Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army, and David left the things in charge of his keeper, and he heads out, right? And he gets in verse 24, it says, all the men of Israel went, and they saw the man, and they fled from him, and they were much afraid. So every day they get up, ready to go to battle, ready to go fight, and then Goliath walks out, and they just back up. Like, nope, I'm good. And Goliath is talking trash and calling out the Israelites and telling them how he's going to kill them and telling them how he's going to defy them and telling them how he controls the situation and how everything they're done for. Send somebody to fight me. And David, this young teenage boy, hears this. And I love his response. In verse 26 it says this, and David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Just a little bit before, as we talked last week, David is anointed as king. David is following God very, very closely. His relationship with God is solid as can be. And David rolls up on the scene as this 15-year-old or young teenage boy and sees this 9-foot giant talking trash to people. And seeing that everybody, the army of Israel, the best warriors that Israel have, are shaken and strucken with fear, and they are scared to death. And this young teenage boy is like, well, what happens for the guy that takes this dude out? Like, what happened? What do I get? Or what does someone get if they kill this guy? By the way, who is this uncircumcised, dirty, nasty person, Philistine, who defiles the army of God? Like, God's got our back. Like, why are y'all scared of this dude? Like, let's go get him. Like, what's wrong with y'all? I mean, can you imagine, as a grown man, we're already trying to figure something out, and one of our youth walks in and is like, dude, what are y'all doing? Let's go, right? What are y'all scared for? And in the moment that David begins to tell these guys, hey, what's up? Like, we are the army of the living God. Like, we've got God on our side. Like, why would we be scared of anything? Why would we not step into anything? Last week I told you that God's not concerned about numbers. He's not concerned about any of that. He's concerned about our faith and how big is our faith and how much can we step out in faith? How much can we trust Him? If we control everything in our life, then what good is that if we're not trusting God? And so God's not concerned about numbers. He's concerned about our faith. They had numbers, but David had faith. And David's like, what are you guys worried about? And in that moment, right around verse 28, David's older brother stands up. Maybe out of frustration, maybe out of jealousy, right? Because he was there when David was anointed king just a few days before, whatever, right? Typically the oldest brother, like I told you last week, the oldest brother would be the next to take the proper takeover for dad and be the person who would be in charge, the oldest, and all of a sudden not the oldest, but the youngest, right? His older brother stands up out of frustration and jealousy, starts to call David out like, hey man, don't you have some sheep to tend to? What are you even doing here? Why are you even here? Like, don't you have a job back home to do? Don't your little sheep need you or something? Like, what are you here for? And David looks at his brother and says, kind of just blows him off. Turns back around, looks at the men and says, let's do this. Like, what's happening? Like, why are you guys so scared? And as David began to talk to the men, and as David began to talk to the army of Israel, the men begin to talk amongst themselves, right? Like, who is this guy? What's he doing? You see what this guy, like, he's talking about, we're the army of the living God. Like, he really has confidence that he could kill this guy. Like, what's happening? And as the men begin to continue to talk amongst themselves, word gets back to Saul. And Saul sends for David. And David walks into the presence of Saul. And he tells Saul this. He goes, listen, God's got this. God has delivered me from the paw of the bear. God has delivered me from the paw of the lion, because as a shepherd I have had to protect my sheep, and I've killed a bear and I've killed a lion. And if God can protect me from a bear and a lion, this 9-foot giant isn't anything for me, because God's got my back and I can step into this. And I like Saul's response right around verse 37. At the very end it says, and Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And I wonder, right? As I read that this week, I wondered what Saul's response was. Like, what his demeanor, not his response, but his demeanor. Like, was he like, all right, man, like, I'll pray for you. Good luck stepping out in faith. Good luck stepping out there and taking on the 9-foot giant. None of us will do it, but God be with you, man. I'll pray for you, right? I'm praying for you. I wonder if it was like that, or if he literally was sincere and like, may the Lord be with you because you've got courage that I don't have. And so as you step out, God be with you. Like, I wonder, like, if you could go back in time and be like a fly on the wall, as they say, or just be in the tent as David and Saul are having this conversation, I wonder what Saul's demeanor was like. I want to, and it's just me, it's not in Scripture, but in my opinion, I feel like it was kind of one of those, like, I got you, man. Like we do so often. Like, what? Wait a second. You're going to quit your job and go to the mission field? Like, what? I'll pray for you, man. May God be with you, right? You're going to quit your job and go do this. You're going to change jobs. You're going to do this. You're going to step out in faith and do that. You're going to do this or do that, whatever it is. And people tell us these giant leaps of faith that they're going to make. And we're just like, that's good for you, man. Praying for you, right? Good luck, right? I feel like it's that way, but I don't know. And so Saul takes David into his tent. And he says, well, if you're going to go fight this giant, then you need armor. So here, I'll give you my armor, and we'll put all this stuff on you. And they put all this armor and give David a sword. And David's just this young teenage boy. And I just imagine him just being weighed down by all this stuff, right? Just weighed down by the weight of everything that Saul is trying to put on him, because Saul knows what's best when David really knows what he needs and that God's got his back. And David doesn't have it on but just a few minutes. He just sheds it. He's like, I can't fight with this. I'm good. All I need is me, right? And it says that David walks out of the tent, and there's a brook close by, and he scoops up 5 smooth stones, and he puts them in his bag, and he's got his slingshot that we're all probably pretty familiar with, and he walks out to the battle scene to go and fight Goliath. And I love Goliath's response, because as David steps forward to fight Goliath, or as David steps forward, like in around verse 41, it says, and the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. So finally, here's this battle, right? With the Israelites on the mountaintop and the Philistines on the mountaintop. And this has been going on for days, that Goliath has just been walking out, talking trash, and calling people out. And finally, in the distance, he sees somebody coming down the mountain to come to the valley to fight him. And he's like, finally, somebody had enough courage to step out to fight me. And I can only imagine as David's walking towards Goliath and you start to see the silhouette of somebody coming toward you, that he sees this small, young, teenage boy. And it says that he disdained him, that he just blew him off, that he was just like, really? This is the best that you've got, Israel? And he just begins to tell him, like, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds and to the beasts of the earth, and you're dead meat, kid. Like, you don't stand a chance. And he just begins to talk trash to him. And David, one of my favorite parts of the whole story is David then turns around and just gives it back to him, which is great, right? It said, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut your head off. That's what I'm talking about, right? And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and with spear. For this battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And so it blows my mind to picture this 9-foot giant talking trash to this teenage boy, and the teenage boy's like, what? Like, no, see, this is really the way it's going to go down, Mr. Goliath. Like, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to cut your head off, and I'm going to feed you and all your men to the birds and to the beasts of the earth. Like, I think you got this all wrong. You may be 9 foot tall, over 9 foot tall, and a big dude, but I'm good because I've got God on my side, and so I'm taking you out today, and you're the one that's going to suffer, and all your men are going to suffer, and this is the way that it's going to go down because I've got God on my side. And then the part of the story that most of us are familiar with is what will be here on the screens, and let's just read together. It says, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Don't miss that part because we're going to come back to that. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. And he struck the Philistine, and he killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and he drew it out of its sheath, and he killed him, and he cut his head off with it. And then the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, and they fled. Uh-oh. And then the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shamir as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. I love this part of the story. That it says that David and Goliath are talking trash to each other. And it says that as David tells Goliath, which I can't only imagine how angry, like Goliath is this warrior who's never lost a fight, who is the warrior of all warriors, and here's this snotty-nosed little punk teenage kid talking crap to him, right? He's got to be angry. And David telling this is what's about to go down. And it says that Goliath began to walk out to the battle line to go and face David. And it says that David ran quickly to him. David had that much confidence in God. David had that much confidence in who God was that he could run out to the battle line quickly, that he wasn't worried about a thing. He ran to the battle line quickly. And then on his way there, as he's running probably full speed, he reaches in and grabs a stone. And we know the story that he slings it around and tosses it, right? Boom! Hits the dude right in the forehead, right? Hits the dude right in the forehead. Says that it sinks in and he just falls forward. And like everybody's like, that would be your favorite part of the story. But my favorite part of the story is not just that, but the aftermath. That David told him he was going to cut his head off, right? So he walks over him and he stands over the top of him. Like if you ever just, Like, I played basketball a lot. Like, you just beat someone 101 or you block their shot and they fall down and you're just like, boom, gotcha, right? Got you. And David just walks out and stands over the Philistine and takes out Goliath's sword. Not his sword, but Goliath's sword. And cuts the dude's head off. Like, now what, right? Boom! Cuts his head off. And then everybody starts freaking out. Now the Philistines are scared and they start running. And now the Israelites are like, uh-oh! Oh boy, David got this. And all of a sudden now they've got all this confidence and then they begin to chase the Philistines out of town. And they kill them and they plunder their camp. And it says that David brought the head of Goliath back to Jerusalem, but he kept his armor. And I thought it was interesting to me that David held on to that. Like, has God ever done a significant moment in your life and you just needed to hold on to something? I wonder if that's what David was doing. That God showed up in a mighty way and David's like, just in case I ever forget, I'm just going to set this armor right over here so that I can remember. And so often when we hear the story of David and Goliath, it usually takes one or two paths. The first one is typically in the way that I've always presented it, in the way that I've always preached it, and the idea of this. What's the Goliath in your life? What is it that God's calling you to? What is it that you need to step out in courage? What is it that you need to conquer? What is it that you have to have courage that you can defeat the Goliath that's in your life so that you can have courage and strength to step into? Because whatever that Goliath is, you can defeat that Goliath. You can beat that. Most of the time, most of the sermons that I've ever heard in David and Goliath goes along that pathway. Of whatever the Goliath is in your life, you can have the courage like David did to defeat it. Or maybe it's more of like David's eyes were on God and not on his circumstance, so he wasn't concerned about it. So often the way that we view God controls our circumstance. So often the way that we view God controls how we feel and how we act in a situation. David wasn't worried about a thing. David knew that God had his back. He wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. There's grown men shaking in their boots, and this teenage boy is about to go kill this giant because he knew that God had his back and that God was in control and that God was large and in charge and that God was going to win this victory for him. He had a view of God that is unscathed, that is unshakable. And for us, sometimes we sit in a situation and we're so worried about what God's doing or whether God's going to show up or not going to show up, or I need to control it, or I need to do this, or I need to do that. And our view of God changes just a little bit and we put more reliance on ourselves than on God. And then we feel upset or worried or scared, shaken, fearful. David's view of God controlled his circumstance where he wasn't worried about anything. And typically 9 out of 10 times, at least for me, every sermon that I've heard about David and Goliath has taken one of those two pathways. But today I want to just put a little spin on it for the next couple minutes about the idea that maybe the Goliath in your life isn't some big step of faith that you need to take. Maybe it's not some huge leap that you need to make, that you're going to quit your job and plant a church, or quit here and go be a missionary, or quit here and do this or do that, or take a new job or do this, or where you're going to go to school. Like these huge leaps of faith that you need to take. But maybe the Goliath in your life is a sin that's keeping you from serving God the way that you need to. That maybe there's something inside of you, something that's holding you back from being able to serve God the way that you need to. And maybe the Goliath in your life isn't a step of faith that you need to take, but something that you need to deal with inside. That David is a champion. David is the champion of champions because he took out the indestructible, unkillable Goliath. But in the same way that David is a champion, we, especially for those of us in the room that are believers, we have a champion, and his name is Jesus. That in the same way that David pursued Goliath, in the same way that David ran full speed to Goliath, when Goliath began to step out to the battle line, it says that David ran after him with everything that he had, that he ran quickly. In the same way that David ran at Goliath to defeat him is the same way that Jesus ran towards the cross for you and for me to defeat sin. And that maybe there's something in our lives, something that's holding us back, something that is in our lives that we need to deal with. For some of us, it might be greed. For some of us, it might be pride. For some of us, it may be lust for pornography or drugs or alcohol or whatever it may be. I don't know. One of the speakers that we had at camp year after year used to call it his pet sin. Right? That you keep it on a leash and you kind of walk with it and you keep it close to you, and every once in a while you let it get away, but every once in a while you kind of pet it and kind of keep it next to you that nobody really knows about it, but it's kind of your pet sin. If we're going to be the people that God's called us to be, if we're going to step into the things that God is calling us to, then we've got to deal with the things that are going on inside of us, and we've got to deal with the things that we struggle with, and we've got to deal with the things that we battle the most. All of us have something that we're battling. All of us have something that we're dealing with. Whatever that may be for you, I don't know. I've always been really transparent. For me, it's pride. That I try to make sure that everything that we're doing here at CityPlace is for God and not for me. That it's not about me. That it's not even about CityPlace. This isn't my church or Jordan's church or Josiah's church. This is God's church. He's just called us to help lead it. But for me, it's pride, that thing that I have to deal with, that God's using me to do some cool stuff, and I have to make sure that I give Him the glory and I don't take any of that glory myself. I'm always will be very transparent with you guys and the things that I struggle with. Maybe for you, whatever it may be, whatever the Goliath is in your life that you need to defeat, I want you to know that the reason why you can do that is in the way that David was a champion, is that Jesus is our champion. And Jesus ran full speed, knowing his entire life what the outcome was going to be, as he headed to the cross for you and for me. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. I think sometimes we forget exactly the sacrifice and the things that he did for us. And that because of what he did, we can live in freedom. We can live with a freedom that doesn't come from anywhere else. It doesn't come from another person. It doesn't come from a friendship. It doesn't come from a relationship. It doesn't come from anything else but Him. But He gives us a freedom to live our life in a way where we know, like David, that God has got my back no matter what, and I can run full speed into whatever it is that you're calling me to take on whatever it is, and to deal with whatever I need to deal with, because God is my champion, that Jesus is a champion. For 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus is in the wilderness, preparing himself for what he was going to do, knowing ultimately what his ultimate call was. And I believe that in the same way that Goliath taunted David, in the way that Goliath taunted the Israelites day after day after day after day, it's the same way that some of the sin that we have in our life taunts us and holds us back from exactly what God has called us to. That God has a great plan for all of us. Just like last week, God knows the plan for your life before you even realize your potential. And a lot of times we don't even realize the potential that we have because we're so caught back by this Goliath that's in our life that's holding us back. The sin that taunts you in your life, that tells you, you're not worth anything. You can't do this. You can't do that. It's okay if you just look at this one more time. It's okay if you just use this one more time. It's okay if you go into your room and look at the computer when no one else is around. Like, it's okay to go do this. It's okay to go do that. It's all right. The sin that taunts us in the same way that Goliath taunted the Israelites. David's full confidence was in who God is. And we should have that same type of confidence because we know what Jesus did for us. That Jesus died on a cross and conquered death. And if Jesus can conquer death, then we can conquer whatever sin or whatever Goliath we need to accomplish in our life or need to get through and past and over and done with. In the same way that David cut off Goliath's head, we can cut the head of that off. And the way that we do that is through Jesus. We all have something that we're struggling with. If you sit here today and say you don't, you're lying. Because we do. There's no way that all of us or any of us are absolutely perfect. It could be something as big as pornography or lust or pride or greed, or it could be something as simple as self-confidence or self-esteem in yourself that you allow the devil to speak into you that you're not worth anything. The lack of control that we want to give to God because we just want to control everything ourselves because I'm better at it than He is. No, you're not. I can control it. I can run it. I can lead it. I can do it. God, I'll call you if I need you. Just stay on the bat phone close by, right? If I need you, I'll call you. But if we flip that and we give it to Him and let Him control and let Him run it and let Him run our lives the way that David let God run his, then we could run full speed ahead. As many times as I've read the story of David and Goliath, as many times as I've read through the story and preached the story, I've always missed the fact that David ran at Goliath. It's my new favorite part of the story, other than cutting his head off. That he just ran full speed ahead. And so this morning, I'm going to ask for you guys just to close your eyes and bow your heads for just a moment.